In John chapter 12, verse 3, we see this beautiful picture of this woman named Mary who worships Jesus by kneeling down and wiping his feet with these very, very expensive perfume. This act of worship is extremely expensive and very costly and really socially awkward. But Mary does this act of worship because she loves Jesus. In the end, she uses her hair, bends down and uses her hair to wipe Jesus' feet. Well, Mary's vulnerability in this act of worship is contrasted in the story with Judas Iscariot's indignation. He crosses his arms and he rolls his eyes and he says, "This is a waste of money. This act of worship is pathetic." But Jesus shushes Judas Iscariot and says, Mary's act of worship isn't pathetic, it's prophetic. A little while later, as Gary mentioned last week in the sermon, the disciples are able to worship Jesus again as Jesus rides on this unridden colt triumphantly into Jerusalem. And the disciples and the people in the city, they're just excited and jubilant and they're awkward, but they just praise Jesus with their entire hearts. And the same thing happens because then this time it's the Pharisees that cross their arms and roll their eyes and say, "Jesus, this worship of you, that's pathetic." And Jesus responds again and shushes the Pharisees this time and says, "This worship of me is not pathetic, it is prophetic." And then as Passion Week unfolds, we see Jesus in the upper room with the disciples, and then Judas Iscariot betrays Jesus. And then next we see Jesus in the garden praying, Jesus is arrested, and then later Jesus is whipped and beaten, and there's a crown of thorns on his brow. And now the tables have turned, as you can see. Originally it was Mary who was going all out for Jesus, and his disciples who were going all out for Jesus. But now it's Jesus who's going all out for his disciples in the most radical way. And he's going all out for the disciples now, he's going all out for Mary, and he's also going out for all the disciples in history, including you and me. And Jesus says, "I'm going to go all out for you now." And then upon the cross, of course, there's this public humiliation, and there's pain, and there's suffering, and there's isolation from the Father, as he offers himself as a sacrifice, as he pours himself out like costly perfume for us, his disciples. And then that most tragic moment is when God dies for us on the cross. And that is what we experienced 2 days ago in our Good Friday service. Well, 3 days later, we arrive at our verses this morning. We see these women bringing spices to the grave, and verse 10 names them: Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary, the mother of James, and the other woman, it says. 3 women bringing spices, and I have some spices here. When Jesus was born, there were 3 wise men, or so legend has it. There's at least 3 gifts. 3 wise men brought spices and gifts to Jesus. And then at his death, there's 3 wise women who bring spices to Jesus to honor him. Possibly the same myrrh that Mary received 30 years earlier from the wise men. So the women arrive at the grave, but they're puzzled because verse 2, the stone is rolled away. Verse 3, there's no body. Verse 4, there's 2 men who greet the women at the tomb dressed in shiny clothes. In Greek, this word is astrapto, to give off very bright light. Clothes are not supposed to be alive and flashing like lightning. Yet these men wore clothes that were a strapo. The women had no expectation that Jesus would be alive when they got to the grave, and that's why they brought spices. I remember being in the Louvre in Paris, and we went down into the museum part, and we saw the mummies of Egypt. And I remember being in that museum and really hoping that, or in fact, I paid money so that my family wouldn't have these mummies come back to life. That's what you don't want to have happen. That's what your fear is in these museums with these strange mummies. And same with these women who are taking these spices to this graveyard. They are not expecting life to come from this grave. But at the graveyard, they're met with this oppositeness. Men are wearing glowing clothes, and they have this glowing message. Why do you look for the living among the dead? This is verse 5. He is not here, but he has risen. This great reversal has happened. And what is amazing is how quickly the women's minds change and adapt to this new information. They don't roll their eyes in disbelief or cross their arms, but instantly they engage with this new good news. Perhaps God invited women to come to the tomb first because women are better at processing information than men. Deborah, my wife, who happens to be holding the camera, thank you, Deborah, is amazing at processing information quickly. I'm a slow learner. I'm still having difficulty with being a parent, being a father, being a husband, even following Jesus. I'm still learning. It's a lot of information. It takes me a while to catch up. But somehow these women at the graveyard, do you see this amazing change in their minds? This biggest hairpin turn of the entire world, that God would die, but then God would be raised back to life for us. And they go along with it. Imagine if you could have done a brain scan of the woman's mind right then. And so as they rush off to tell the men disciples, you wonder, how are the men disciples going to respond? Are they going to respond rolling eyes, arms crossed? Or are they going to respond like the women do? So it turns out, as you read in the verses, that the women respond one way, but the men respond in the exact opposite. They roll their eyes and say, "You women are out of control. You're over the top." Verse 11 says, "The woman's words appeared to the men disciples like delirium, or as delirium." In original Greek, this word is the word Liros. Now, Liros is a Greek island just off the coast of modern-day Turkey. The island of Liros was this place of exile and torture. 30 years ago, the country of Greece made this island they put 3,000 of their most extreme psychiatric patients at this island under horrible condition. And in English, we get the word delirium from the word Liros. And that's what the Christian men, the disciple men, called the disciple women when they heard this news that Jesus was risen. But before we judge the men too quickly, how often are we more like the men than the women in the story? When the Marys of this world offer Jesus extravagant gifts of worship that seem out of control, how do we respond? When we see the disciples of this world, like in the triumphant entry of Jesus, responding radically, how do we respond? How do we respond when someone tells us the resurrection story? Are we like the women disciples? Or are we like the men disciples? Our world in general is like the men disciples in our story when they hear the Easter message. You Christians are just imagining things. Liros. But look what happens next in our story. It's amazing. Verse 12, Apostle Peter, for some reason, has a spark of light in his heart. A flash, like the angel's clothing, enters into his heart. This idea that all of a sudden erupts in his mind and heart and body? What that caused him to run to the tomb? What caused that spark? What caused Mary to spend a year's wages on Jesus? Perfume, untie her hair. What caused the disciples and the crowd to shout, Hosanna? And what caused Jesus to accept that pain and suffering on our behalf? What caused that flash in Peter's heart? That he would rise to his feet and he'd run towards the grave. Let's run. Good exercise. This spark is what makes all the difference in the world. This spark is what makes all the difference to us. That something comes alive in our heart that was dead, but now is alive. Peter's heart was this grave. It was this dead museum. And all of a sudden, it came to life. The great reversal. Everything opposite of normal happened. The dead Savior is now alive. Like a dead heart that has finally seen the light. Peter jumps up and runs. Now, David Lowes wrote a poem. And this poem is amazing, and I've included it in the notes today. And if you read the poem line by line from top to bottom, it is the poem understanding of Easter that the Pharisees would see. Because it is a story of Easter and Jesus not rising. However, if you read the story line by line, starting from the bottom, each line, and then you read it up, it is the opposite message. It is the story of these three women excited that Jesus has risen, and there's a spark and a life inside of it. So I put this poem as an attachment that you can read after. It makes all the difference how you read the Christian story, this Easter story, this resurrection story. It makes all the difference. If you embrace life like Judas, the Pharisees, the unbelieving men disciples, and read it forward, call it Leros, or you can invite Jesus to ignite the spark in your heart and accept God's reversal. Accept that death works backwards. Just like the first day 2,000 years ago on Sunday morning, the choice remains with you. Jesus was crushed so that we will never be crushed. Jesus was lifted up on a cross so that we will never be driven down into the pit. Death and Hades, they thought they outsmarted Jesus when they entered into his body, but inside Jesus' bodies they were trapped and they were driven into nothing and they were crushed by Jesus. That is why death no longer has the last word, and that is why Christ now has the first word. Death no longer has a sting, but rather a reward for those who read this story backward. Because of this day, and because of these women and their good news, there is nothing that can separate us from the love of God through Jesus Christ. So this Easter, we invite you to free yourself of crossing your arms and rolling your eyes, and instead join Mary and even Apostle Peter in his lightning flash running to see the empty tomb for yourself. Because Christ is risen, he has risen indeed.